Fayette County, West Virginia, March 14, 1887. 5:47 in the morning. Behind the east wall of a limestone cavity at 22 feet below the surface of the Alderson Farm, 11 feet of sealed darkness had been waiting for something to break through. The bore rod struck wrong. Not the dull resistance of clay or the clean refusal of bedrock. Something hollow. Something that swallowed the impact and gave nothing back. Elias Croft, 43 years old, pulled the rod free and stood still for a moment in the cold of the shaft. He had been digging wells since he was 24 years old, 19 years of reading the earth through the handle of a tool, and in 19 years he had learned to trust the thing a rod tells your hands before your mind catches up. He had drilled through sandstone and shale and the packed blue clay of the Kanawha Valley floor.
He had struck pockets of natural gas that hissed like something alive. He had once hit a vein of black water at 40 feet that ran cold even in July and tasted of iron and age. He knew what hollow meant. He had heard it before. He had not heard it like this. He set the rod aside and went to his knees in the shaft. The morning light barely reached him.
He worked by feel, pressing both palms flat against the east wall of the excavation, moving them slowly across the surface until he found what the rod had found. A seam. Horizontal. Clean. A seam that had not been made by water or by time. He followed it with his thumb to the left and found a corner, then another. He sat back on his heels and breathed the cold underground air and thought about what corners meant. He did not call up to the surface. He picked up his short iron bar and began to work. 40 minutes later, a section of the wall approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet high came loose in his hands. The air that came through the gap was not cold. It was the same temperature as the earth around it, which in late winter was 44 degrees. But the smell was different. Dry, close, and faintly mineral in a way that was not the smell of limestone or wet clay. He had smelled something like it once before, in a sealed room in an old farmhouse cellar, a room that had been closed for 60 years. The smell of complete stillness, of air that had not moved. He held his lamp to the opening. 11 figures were standing in the dark. They had been standing there before the first nail was driven into the first timber of the first cabin in Fayette County, before the French trappers came down through the Ohio drainage, before the Shawnee moved through these hills on their way to somewhere else. They had been standing there before any civilization the official record places within 1,000 miles of this location. 8 feet and 4 inches from the heel of the left foot to the crown of the skull on the nearest one. 31 inches of femur. Shoulders that in life would have cleared the ceiling of any room Elias Croft had ever stood inside. Standing against the chamber wall in a row, upright, arranged, not buried, standing. He got back to his feet and climbed out of the shaft, and when Martha Alderson came out of the farmhouse to ask why he had stopped drilling, he asked her for a ruler and a lamp, and told her what was at the bottom of her well.
But here is what the Bureau of American Ethnology has spent 138 years making sure you never ask about. Fayette County sits in the heart of the Kanawha River drainage, the same geological corridor that runs from the New River Highlands down to the Ohio confluence, through some of the most heavily mined ground in the eastern United States. The hills above the valley had been producing bituminous coal since the 1830s, and by 1887, the region was knitted together by a network of wagon roads, rail lines, and the working class of men who moved through them. Miners, timbermen, survey crews, and the smaller tradesmen who served them. Among them were the well diggers, men who operated independently, hired by households and small farms, who moved across the county one job at a time, and whose knowledge of the ground beneath Fayette County was intimate and first-hand, and almost entirely unrecorded. Elias Croft was one of them. He had grown up in Nicholas County, moved to Fayette County in 1874 after his first year of independent work, and had spent the following 13 years learning the specific geology of this particular stretch of valley. He knew which ridgelines held water and which ones would run dry by August. He knew the difference between a clay cap that would seal a well properly and one that would collapse inside a year. He knew how limestone behaved under load, where it bridged and where it failed, and he knew that what he had found at 22 feet below Martha Alderson's east pasture was not a natural cavity. The corners had told him that. The seam had told him that. And the 11 figures inside had told him something that no amount of geological experience was going to explain. His field notebook, a brown paper-covered ledger 6 inches by 4 that he carried in his coat pocket on every job, was already open by the time he went back down into the shaft with Martha Alderson's 12-inch ruler and her spare lamp. He worked methodically. He was a man who billed by the foot and documented his measurements because measurement was his livelihood, and that professional habit did not leave him when the subject was extraordinary. He recorded the height and width of the opening he had made. He recorded the dimensions of the chamber, 11 feet in length, 6 feet in width, 4 feet 11 inches at the tallest point of the ceiling. He noted that the ceiling showed tool marks, parallel striations, uniform spacing, approximately 2 inches between each groove, and that the stone was not native limestone. It was a darker material, denser, and it had not been quarried from the hillside above. He noted that the floor was smooth. He noted the orientation of the chamber. The long axis ran approximately east-west, and the figures stood along the north wall. He measured the nearest one. Heel to crown, 8 feet 4 inches. He moved the ruler across the skull, 9 inches front to back at the widest point.
The width at the brow, 7.5 inches, he wrote, near twice the width of a man's head at the brow. He measured the femur, 31 inches. He measured the span of the rib cage at its widest point, working the ruler around the curve of the bones, and came up with a figure of 42 inches. He wrote that down too. Above the skull, positioned carefully, propped against the chamber wall, was a flat stone approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, polished on one face to a surface smoother than any stone he had seen that had not been worked by a machine. The polished face carried incised markings in a pattern he described as rectilinear, right-angle lines, parallel rows, what appeared to be a border around the perimeter. He copied the pattern as well as he could into the notebook, ruling out the lines freehand with the pencil stub he used for measurements. He spent 11 minutes on the sketch.
He wrote, "Markings unknown to me." He was not a man given to exaggeration. He noted the date, the time, the depth, the compass orientation of the site, and the weather conditions above ground. He noted that the clay seal above the chamber had been undisturbed when he reached it, and that the chamber itself showed no evidence of recent entry from any direction. He noted that the figures showed no sign of having been placed there recently. The bones had the color and surface texture of very old things, the pale brown of objects that had spent centuries in dry, sealed darkness. He noted that there was no wood, no textile, no organic material he could identify. 11 figures standing against the north wall of a sealed chamber at 22 feet below an empty pasture in western Fayette County, West Virginia. He climbed back out of the shaft and told Martha Alderson what he had written down. She went inside to send a message to her brother in Fayetteville. Croft went back to his notebook. The earliest verified documentation of a sealed underground chamber in the Kanawha River drainage predates Elias Croft's find by 8 years. In October 1879, a crew of 3 men digging a drainage culvert for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway extension through Putnam County broke through a limestone shelf at 16 feet and found what the crew foreman, a 40-year-old Scotch-Irish timberman named Reuben Thacker, described in his work log as a room with smooth walls and bones arranged on a stone floor. Thacker's work log entry is brief: the date, the depth, the description, and a note that the crew superintendent arrived within the hour and directed them to proceed with backfilling. The entry is followed by a blank line, and then the next day's drainage measurements. Thacker never returned to the subject in his writing. What makes the Thacker entry significant is not what he wrote, but what happened to it. His work log was submitted to the C&O Railways Engineering Office in Charleston at the end of the 1879 season, as part of standard record keeping. It was catalogued in the railway's administrative files, where it remained until 1923, when a routine archive transfer moved 40 years of engineering records to a storage facility in Huntington. In 1927, the West Virginia State Archives requested copies of the C&O engineering files for the period 1876 to 1882 as part of a general infrastructure documentation project. The response from the Huntington facility confirmed receipt of the transfer, but listed the 1879 Putnam County culvert records as missing. Not destroyed, not relocated, simply absent from the boxes that should have contained them. The gap is noted in the West Virginia State Archives correspondence file dated September 19, 27. It has never been explained. 8 years after Thacker put his pen down, Elias Croft picked his up. The chamber he found was larger, the remains more numerous, and the documentation more detailed. But the sequence that followed was the same. On the morning of March 17, 1887, 3 days after the discovery, 2 men arrived at the Alderson Farm in a private wagon. They identified themselves as representatives of the Federal Bureau of American Ethnology, which had been established in Washington in 1879, specifically to catalog and study the physical and cultural evidence of Native American populations. They did not present written credentials. They did not carry a document of authorization from any court or any federal office. Martha Alderson, who had allowed Croft to continue documenting the site for 3 days while waiting for her brother to arrive from Fayetteville, met them at the door of the farmhouse and asked to see their papers. One of the men, she later described him as tall, thin, wearing a dark coat that was too heavy for the weather, told her the matter was of federal concern and that the documentation was not required for property she did not own. She owned the land. She had owned it since her husband's death in 1882. She told him so. He went to look at the shaft. The man who remained on the porch told her that the Bureau would need to inspect the site and remove any materials of ethnological significance. She asked what that meant. He said it meant the bones. She asked about the stone. He said the stone as well. She asked if they would leave a receipt.
He said the Bureau would be in contact. Croft was in the shaft when the taller man came to the edge and looked down. He looked down for perhaps 30 seconds without speaking. Then he told Croft to come up. Croft came up. The man told him that the site was now under federal jurisdiction and that his field notes would be required for the official record. Croft said he had 1 set of notes. He handed them over. He did not say that he had spent the previous evening copying the full contents of the notebook, measurements, sketches, the copied markings, into a second notebook that was in the inside breast pocket of his coat at that moment. The 2 men went down into the shaft. They were below for approximately 40 minutes. When they came back up, they directed Martha Alderson's hired hand, a 17-year-old named Franklin Boyer, who had been watching from the barn door, to begin backfilling. Boyer started filling. The taller man supervised. The shorter man carried a canvas-wrapped wooden crate from the wagon to the shaft and handed it down. What was in the crate when they lowered it is not recorded. What was in the crate when they loaded it back onto the wagon and drove away toward the Fayetteville Rail Depot that afternoon is also not recorded. No manifest was produced. No receipt was given.
Martha Alderson wrote to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington 2 weeks later, asking for acknowledgement that her property had been accessed and her site materials removed. She received no reply. The Bureau of American Ethnology Annual Report for 1887 to 1888 runs to 412 pages. It documents specimen acquisitions, field correspondence, and catalog entries from operations across 22 states. The incoming specimen log for the period March through April 1887 contains a gap. Catalog entries numbered 1104 through 1106 are absent. No annotation explains the absence. No cross-reference directs the reader to a supplementary file. The three entries simply do not exist in a sequence that otherwise proceeds without interruption. The gap was identified in April 2021 by Gordon Ashby, a retired archival researcher from Morgantown, West Virginia, who filed a Freedom of Information request with the Smithsonian Institution, which absorbed the Bureau's records in 1965, requesting all field correspondence from Bureau operatives assigned to West Virginia during the first quarter of 1887. The Smithsonian's response, dated July 2021, cited Exemption 3 of the Freedom of Information Act, asserting that the records in question were protected under a statute governing pre-1900 ethnological materials. No statute matching that description appears in the cited section of the Act. Ashby filed a formal appeal in September 2021. The appeal has not been resolved. What is recorded is this. The Fayetteville Tribune of March 19, 1887, 5 days after the discovery, ran a report on the front page of its weekly edition under the headline, "Remarkable Discovery on Alderson Farm. Well Digging Exposes Ancient Chamber." The article is 4 columns wide and quotes Croft directly, giving his measurements in the same figures that appear in his surviving notebook. It describes the stone tablet. It names the Bureau representatives as having arrived and removed the materials. It does not name the Bureau representatives. It describes Martha Alderson as having been denied a receipt. The article is the only contemporaneous press coverage of the discovery on record. The Fayetteville Tribune's archive for 1887 is held by the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston. Issues 1 through 10 of the 1887 run are present and cataloged. Issues 11 through 14 are absent. Issue 12 would have been the follow-up. What makes this pattern significant is not any single absence. It is the arithmetic of the absences. The C&O Railway Engineering records for October 1879, gone. The Bureau of American Ethnology specimen log entries for March 1887, gone. The Fayetteville Tribune issues for the weeks following the Croft discovery, gone. The Smithsonian's field correspondence for West Virginia in early 1887, sealed. Each absence is individually explicable. Records are lost, archives are incomplete, files are misfiled. But the specific category of record that is absent in each case is identical. The documentation created in the immediate aftermath of a find, before the federal response was complete. The first report, the follow-up article, the catalog entry that would have named the object and its origin. A company does not absorb the cost of suppressing a record unless that record is worth more than the cost of suppressing it. A federal institution does not maintain a sealed archive for 138 years on the basis of administrative oversight. The absences are not careless. They are surgical. What Elias Croft found at 22 feet below the east pasture of the Alderson Farm was physically impossible under the official account of human settlement in North America. The official account places the first anatomically modern human occupation of the eastern United States at approximately 14,000 years before present, following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. It places the earliest evidence of organized burial practice in the Ohio Valley at approximately 3,000 years before present, with the Adena culture. It places the earliest evidence of above-ground architectural construction in the region, earthworks, platform mounds, at approximately 2,500 years before present. The geological strata above the Alderson Farm chamber, 3 feet of compacted red clay underlaid by 9 feet of glacial till deposited during the last glacial retreat, places the chamber's construction at a minimum of 10,000 years before present, predating every recognized civilization in the Ohio drainage by 8,000 years. The chamber's interior dimensions, smooth walls, uniform tool marks at 2-inch spacing, a ceiling that showed evidence of deliberate shaping, required a level of stoneworking technology inconsistent with any culture assigned to this region at that date.
The tool marks Croft described and sketched were parallel, consistent in depth and spacing, and covered the full surface of the ceiling. A lithic tool, a stone-edged implement, the only technology the official timeline assigns to North American populations at this period, cannot produce parallel striations at uniform depth across a limestone ceiling.
The variance in cut depth from a handheld stone tool over an 11-foot surface, even in the hands of a skilled worker, would be measurable and visible. The marks Croft described were not variable. They were machined. The figures themselves resolve the question independently of the architecture. An anatomically modern human femur averages approximately 18 inches in length. A femur of 31 inches belongs to a body of 8 to 9 feet in standing height. The skeletal proportions Croft recorded, femur length, skull width, rib cage diameter, are internally consistent for a body of those dimensions. They are not consistent with any known human population, ancient or modern. The Adena culture, whose earthwork mounds were being excavated in Ohio and West Virginia throughout the 1880s, was documented as producing human remains of average height. The Smithsonian's own Bureau of American Ethnology published that documentation. What the Smithsonian has never published is any specimen in its collection matching the dimensions Croft recorded. Not from this site. Not from any site. The framework that accommodates these dimensions, this architecture, and this date is not the one taught in any American university. It is the one that the physical evidence from sites across North America, from the Great Lakes copper mines to the sealed chambers of the Appalachian ridgeline, assembles when the institutional filter is removed. The evidence points toward a civilization of significant technological capacity operating across this continent before the period the official timeline assigns to pre-Columbian North America, a civilization whose physical traces were systematically cataloged and removed by federal institutions beginning in the 1870s.
The academic term for what the evidence describes, what researchers outside the institutional framework have called the builders of the sealed chambers, the operators of the Isle Royal copper mines, the architects of the geometrically precise earthwork networks of the Ohio Valley, is Tartarian. The Tartarian hypothesis names a technologically sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization whose presence across North America was documented in physical evidence and then suppressed. The Alderson Farm chamber is not an anomaly within that framework. It is a data point, one of hundreds. The framework fits the physical evidence.
The official timeline does not. The closest parallel in the global record is the chamber complex at Hal Saflieni in Malta, where sealed stone chambers cut from limestone at multiple depths were found to contain the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals. The chambers showing tool marks consistent with metal-edged implements at a date the official chronology assigns to a population with no metal tools. The Maltese chambers were found in 1902. The earliest skeletal remains recovered from them have been dated by isotopic analysis to approximately 5,000 years before present. The architectural parallels with the Alderson Farm chamber, the smooth stone ceiling, the deliberate shaping, the sealed entry, are not incidental.
They describe the same construction method at the same anomalous date on opposite sides of an ocean. The official explanation for Malta is that the construction was achieved with antler picks and stone hammers. The tool marks say otherwise. So do Elias Croft's sketches. The Alderson Farm parcel passed through two private owners after Martha Alderson's death in 1901, before being acquired in 1974 by Meridian Land Holdings, LLC.
Meridian is a Delaware-registered limited liability company with a registered agent in Wilmington, whose public filings trace to a federal contractor specializing in land title management for government-adjacent property acquisitions. The contractor has held registered agent relationships with more than 40 LLCs acquiring land in the Ohio and Kanawha River drainages since 1965, the same year the Smithsonian Institution absorbed the Bureau of American Ethnology's records. Meridian Land Holdings has filed no commercial activity with the West Virginia Secretary of State since incorporation. It holds no active agricultural permits. It holds no mineral extraction rights, Those were severed from the surface title in 1962. It employs no staff. It has no website. Its 63 acres in Fayette County sit untouched and unfiled upon, assessed at agricultural rates, generating no revenue, incurring no development costs, requiring no maintenance beyond the fence line. The fence on the eastern quarter of the property, the quarter containing the original well site, is chain link, 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. It runs approximately 200 feet on each of 4 sides, enclosing a rectangular area centered on the coordinates of the Alderson farmhouse site, which burned in 1943 and was never rebuilt.
The gate carries a padlock and a no trespassing notice issued by the United States Department of the Interior. The surveillance camera mounted above the gate was installed in 2019. The fence is older, the camera is newer. Someone has continued to find the fence sufficient for 49 years and then decided in 2019 that it was not sufficient alone. No permit record for the camera installation appears in the Fayette County permitting database. No utility line serves the camera. It runs on a cellular data connection, which means someone is paying for that connection, which means there is an account, which means there is a name attached to the account.
A Freedom of Information request filed in November 2022 by the West Virginia Environmental Coalition, requesting all Interior Department records pertaining to land use restrictions on privately held parcels in Fayette County, produced 112 pages of responsive documents, none of which mention the Alderson Farm parcel or the Meridian Landholdings acquisition. The parcel does not appear in the Interior Department's records as subject to any federal land use restriction. The no trespassing notice on the gate, which cites Interior Department authority, references a jurisdiction the department's own records do not confirm it holds over this property. The camera watches an empty field.
It has been watching since 2019. Whatever is still under that field is worth watching. The man who understood what Croft had found better than anyone outside the Federal Bureau was not a scientist. He was a retired postal inspector named George Fulton, 68 years old, who had spent 31 years moving through the same counties of the Kanawha drainage that Croft had drilled through. Fulton had not seen the chamber, but he had seen the pattern. In the spring of 1921, 34 years after the Alderson find, Fulton gave a long interview to a freelance journalist named Edwin Marsh, who was collecting accounts of anomalous discoveries in the Ohio Valley for a book he was writing at his own expense. Fulton had not been at the Alderson farm, but in the spring of 1887 he had been in Fayetteville on business, and he had seen the 2 Bureau men loading a crate onto the wagon at the rail depot.
He had noticed them because he was a postal inspector, and the crate had no shipping label. He had asked the depot agent about it. The depot agent had told him it was a federal transfer, no manifest required, no destination listed, government business. Fulton told Marsh he had seen the same thing 3 times in his career. Federal men loading unlabeled crates onto eastbound trains from the Kanawha Valley depots. 1879 in Putnam County. 1887 in Fayetteville. 1894 in a coal company town outside Montgomery that he would not name. 3 times. Always the same men, or men dressed the same way. Always within days of a report in the local paper about something found underground. Always no manifest. Always eastbound. Marsh submitted the Fulton interview as part of a chapter to 3 publishers between 1921 and 1923. All 3 declined. He filed the interview notes in a cardboard folder with 14 other accounts and stored the folder in a trunk that passed to his daughter after his death in 1947, and from his daughter to the Kanawha County Historical Society in 1983, where it was accessioned and shelved and has not been the subject of any published research. The Marsh collection is listed in the Society's finding aid. The Fulton interview is in Box 4, Folder 7. It has been there for 42 years.
Edwin Marsh could not have known when he was writing his rejected book in 1921 what a man in a federal archive in Washington had cataloged and sealed 34 years earlier. He could not have known about the gap in the Bureau's specimen log, because that log was not publicly accessible and would not be for another 100 years.
He could not have constructed a story that matched the physical evidence at the Alderson Farm, because his account of the depot scene in Fayetteville does not describe the site. It describes the removal 3 days later from a different vantage point. His account corroborates Croft's account without borrowing from it. 2 men, 2 vantage points, 1 sequence. That is not coincidence. That is documentation. Elias Croft filed no formal complaint. He submitted no report to any government body. He was a well digger in Fayette County, West Virginia in 1887, and he understood what happened to working men who made formal complaints about federal actions. He went back to work. He finished Martha Alderson's well, the original commission, the reason he had been on that property in the first place, and he billed her for the completed job, and she paid him. He continued to work in Fayette County for another 11 years, completing the season of 1898 before moving north to Nicholas County to be near his daughter's family. He died in 1914 at age 70. His second notebook, the copy he made on the evening of March 16, 1887, while the 2 bureau men were, presumably, somewhere in transit between Washington and Fayetteville, remained in his possession for the rest of his life. He did not hide it. He did not publicize it.
He kept it in the same kind of brown paper ledger he used for every job, on the same shelf in whatever house he was living in, alongside 23 other field notebooks spanning his career from 1874 to 1898. When he died in 1914, the notebooks passed to his daughter, Eleanor Croft Simmons of Summersville, Nicholas County. When Eleanor died in 1951, they passed to her son, Thomas Simmons of Lewisburg, West Virginia. When Thomas died in 1989, they passed to his daughter, Ruth Ann Croft Simmons, also of Lewisburg, who is 77 years old and who has the notebooks in a metal box in her kitchen. She has shown the March 1887 notebook to 2 people outside her family. One was a graduate student in archaeology at West Virginia University in 2004 who was compiling a survey of 19th-century amateur geological documentation in the Kanawha drainage.
He looked at the notebook, copied the measurements, and wrote in his survey notes that the figures were inconsistent with any known Adena or Hopewell burial context, and that the architectural description was anomalous. His survey was submitted as a master's thesis and has never been published. The second was Gordon Ashby, who found the thesis in the West Virginia University Library in 2020 and drove to Lewisburg to ask Ruth Ann Simmons if he could see the notebook. She showed it to him.
He filed his Freedom of Information request 4 months later. The notebook is not hidden. It is in a kitchen in Lewisburg, West Virginia. The measurements are in it. The sketches are in it. The marginal notation, men came, took the stone, would not give name, is in it. In Croft's hand, in pencil, on the page following the sketch of the incised markings he copied from the polished tablet before the bureau men came down into the shaft and took it. Elias Croft, 43 years old, March 14, 1887. His hands were on the bore rod, reading the earth, when the ground beneath him went hollow. He measured what he found because measurement was his profession. He kept the second copy because he had spent 19 years underground, and he understood that the first copy was already gone. The chamber is still there. 22 feet below the surface, below the fenced east pasture of the old Alderson Farm in Fayette County, West Virginia. The same depth, the same orientation. The long axis still running east to west. The north wall where they stood is still the north wall. The ceiling still carries the marks of whatever cut it. The crate that went east on the train in 1887 carried the stone tablet with the incised markings that no institution has ever catalogued, and the bones from a civilization the official record has never named.
The camera above the gate in Fayette County watches the ground above it. The ground does not move. The well in Breathitt County, Kentucky, 14 miles north across the ridge from a sealed shaft that was backfilled in 1917, has been